I'm Lucia Hartford, 26, and I'm a U.S. Army sergeant who earned my place the slow way: long shifts, shared barracks, no shortcuts. For years, I put family first, sending time, attention, and patience home even when I had little to spare. But at my award ceremony, when my billionaire grandfather asked if the $700,000 housing fund had covered everything, and I answered, "What fund?" I drew a line that changed everything. Ever been dismissed or betrayed by someone you loved and supported? Tell me in the comments, you're not alone. Before we get into it, drop where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, tap like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and taking your power back. What happened next might surprise you. Looking back, I should have noticed the small inconsistencies earlier. The way my parents would suddenly have money for things that didn't quite match their stated budget. The week-long trip to Napa Valley that appeared out of nowhere, followed by Mom's casual explanation that they'd found a great deal. The new leather furniture that replaced their decade-old couch, purchased during what they'd described as a particularly tight month. I was stationed at Fort Bragg then, sharing a cramped room with another sergeant who snored like a freight train. The walls were thin enough that I could hear conversations 3 rooms down, and the communal bathroom required a 10-minute walk down a hallway that smelled perpetually of industrial disinfectant and whatever mystery meat they'd served in the mess hall that week. When I called home, I never mentioned these details. Why worry them? "How's the housing situation, honey?" Mom would ask during our weekly check-ins. "It's fine," I'd say, watching my roommate fold laundry on her bunk. Standard military stuff. "Well, you know if you need anything." But that conversation never went further. They'd pivot to talking about Dad's work, or the neighbors, or some minor drama with my cousin Sarah. The offers of help remained vague, floating in the air like smoke. My grandfather existed in the background of these calls, a steady presence who sent birthday cards with crisp $100 bills and remembered every promotion, every deployment, every small achievement that my parents sometimes forgot to mention to their friends. He'd built his wealth slowly, methodically, turning a small construction company into something that employed half the county. People respected him not because they had to, but because he'd earned it through decades of showing up when others wouldn't. During holiday visits, I'd find him in his study after dinner, reading industry reports and making notes in the margins with a fountain pen that had belonged to his father. He never talked about money directly, but there were always subtle signs of his generosity. The way my parents' mortgage had mysteriously shortened by several years. The college fund that had appeared for my younger brother without much explanation. The quiet way he'd ensure everyone had what they needed without making it feel like charity. "Your grandfather thinks very highly of you," Mom would say, but something in her tone suggested this wasn't entirely comfortable for her. As if his approval highlighted some deficiency in their own support. I started noticing the pattern during my 3rd year of service. My parents would have financial stress, Dad's hours getting cut, unexpected medical bills, the washing machine breaking down, followed by periods of inexplicable relief. They'd mention problems in one conversation, then act as if they'd never existed in the next. When I offered to send money from my modest salary, they'd decline with what seemed like genuine surprise. "Oh no, sweetheart, we're managing fine now." Managing fine. The phrase appeared frequently, usually accompanied by details that suggested the opposite should be true. The vacation to Colorado came during Dad's unpaid leave. The new car appeared shortly after Mom's part-time job ended. When I asked direct questions, the answers came wrapped in vague explanations about unexpected bonuses and insurance settlements that never quite added up. My grandfather remained constant throughout these fluctuations. He'd ask about my service with genuine interest, remembering details from months-old conversations. He wanted to know about my training, my responsibilities, the challenges I faced. Unlike my parents, he never seemed surprised by the realities of military life. "Those barracks treating you well?" he asked during one Christmas visit. "They're what you'd expect," I said. "Nothing fancy, but they keep the rain out." He nodded thoughtfully, as if filing this information away for some future consideration. The disconnect became more obvious as my service continued. I'd mentioned needing to save for months to afford a plane ticket home, while my parents would casually reference weekend trips they'd taken. I'd describe the process of budgeting every dollar of my military pay, while they'd show me photos from restaurants that charged more for a single meal than I spent on food in a week. None of it made complete sense, but questioning it felt wrong somehow. They were my parents. If they said they were managing fine, then presumably they were managing fine. If they could afford things that seemed beyond their means, then maybe I'd misunderstood their means. The military had taught me to trust systems, to believe that information flowed through proper channels and that people generally told the truth about important things. It never occurred to me that this trust might be misplaced when it came to my own family. My parents' attitude toward my career carried an undercurrent I couldn't quite identify. They were proud, certainly. They'd post photos of me in uniform on social media and mention my promotions to their friends. But there was also something that felt like impatience, as if my service was a phase I'd eventually outgrow rather than a commitment I'd made deliberately. "When are you thinking about getting out?" Dad would ask, not understanding that getting out wasn't something I thought about casually. "I'm not," I'd say. "This is what I do." The conversation would stall there, as if they couldn't quite comprehend choosing a life that didn't prioritize financial advancement above all else. They seemed to view my modest salary and basic housing as temporary inconveniences rather than conscious trades I'd made for the privilege of serving. Meanwhile, my grandfather never questioned my choices. He understood duty in a way that didn't require explanation. When I described the satisfaction of leading a team through a difficult training exercise, or the pride of representing my unit at a ceremony, he'd listen with the attention of someone who recognized the value in work that couldn't be measured solely in dollars. The warning signs were all there, scattered across years of conversations and visits. Small inconsistencies that I explained away because the alternative, that my parents were being less than honest about something significant, seemed impossible to consider. I was about to learn just how wrong that assumption was. The ceremony was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in March. Nothing elaborate, just a small gathering in the base commander's office, with a handful of senior officers and a few family members. I'd earned a commendation for my work training new recruits, and the Army had decided it warranted formal recognition. My parents flew in the night before, staying at a hotel near the base that cost more per night than I spent on groceries in 2 weeks. When I suggested they could save money by staying further out, Mom waved off the concern. "Don't worry about it, honey. We want to be close for your big day." My grandfather arrived that morning, driving himself despite being 82 years old. He wore the same dark suit he'd worn to every important family event for the past decade, pressed and immaculate as always. When he hugged me before the ceremony, I could smell the subtle scent of the cologne he'd worn since I was a child. The presentation itself took 15 minutes. The base commander read a brief summary of my service record and achievements, then presented me with a certificate and a small medal that would join the others in a box in my footlocker. Standard military efficiency, meaningful but not elaborate. Afterward, as people milled around offering congratulations and sharing coffee from the hospitality table, my grandfather approached me with the expression of someone who had something important to say. My parents stood nearby, talking with one of my fellow sergeants about the difficulties of military life. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine emotion. "Your service means something." "Thank you, Grandpa. It means a lot that you came." He studied my face for a moment, then asked the question that would change everything. "So, did the $700,000 military housing fund cover everything you needed?" The words hung in the air between us like a physical thing. I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. "What fund?" The conversations around us continued, but something in my grandfather's expression shifted. His eyes moved past me to where my parents were standing, and I watched his face transform from warm affection to something much colder. "The Military Housing Fund," he repeated, his voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. $700,000. To ensure you had proper accommodations during your service." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Grandpa, I don't know anything about a fund. I still live in shared barracks with communal bathrooms." The silence that followed was complete. Not just between us, but spreading outward like ripples on water as people nearby stopped their conversations and turned to look. My parents had gone completely still, their faces pale and stricken. My grandfather's voice, when it came again, was quiet but carried to every corner of the room. Then who stole the $700,000? The question detonated like a bomb in the small space. I watched my parents' expressions crumble, saw the truth written across their faces before either of them said a word. The weight of years of small inconsistencies suddenly made perfect sense, settling into place with the finality of a lock clicking shut. Everything I thought I knew about my family had just been revealed as a lie. I grew up believing my parents loved me unconditionally, the way children do before they understand that love can be complicated by other needs and desires. They were young when I was born, barely out of college themselves, and I remember them as enthusiastic but overwhelmed, the kind of parents who meant well but often seemed surprised by the practical realities of raising a child. My grandfather was different from the beginning. He had patience where they had anxiety, resources where they had limitations. When I was 7 and obsessed with astronomy, he bought me a telescope that probably cost more than my parents' monthly rent. When I wanted to learn piano at 10, he arranged for lessons with the best teacher in town and never mentioned the expense. My parents accepted his generosity with a mixture of gratitude and resentment that I couldn't understand then. They needed his help, but taking it made them feel diminished somehow. I'd catch them whispering about him after family dinners, their voices carrying tones of frustration mixed with dependence. "He makes everything look so easy," Mom would say, not realizing I was listening from the hallway. "Because it is easy for him," Dad would reply. "Must be nice to have money solve every problem." But money didn't solve every problem for my grandfather. He'd lost his wife, my grandmother, when I was 5, and I remember him sitting alone at family gatherings afterward, still setting 2 places at the table out of habit before quietly removing one. He channeled his grief into work and into caring for the family she'd left behind, which included my parents and me. As I got older, I began to recognize the pattern. My parents would encounter some financial obstacle, a medical bill, a car repair, an unexpected expense, and stress would fill our house like smoke. Then, mysteriously, the problem would resolve itself. The bill would be paid, the car would be fixed, the crisis would pass. My parents would breathe easier, but they never quite met my eyes when I asked how they'd managed to work things out. "Your grandfather helped a little," they'd say, if they explained at all. I assumed a little meant a few $100s here and there, the kind of modest assistance that kept families afloat during difficult periods. It never occurred to me that the help might be substantial, systematic, or ongoing. My parents lived modestly, not luxuriously, but comfortably enough that I never questioned whether we had what we needed. When I announced my intention to join the military after high school, their reaction was complicated. Pride, certainly, but also something that looked like disappointment. As if they'd expected me to choose a path that would eventually position me to help them the way my grandfather had helped them. "The military is fine for some people," Mom said carefully. "But you're smart enough for other options." "I want to serve," I told her. "I want to do something that matters." She didn't argue, but I could tell she didn't understand. To her, careers were primarily about financial security and social status. The idea that I might choose a path based on purpose rather than profit seemed foreign. My grandfather supported my decision completely. He understood duty in a way that transcended personal gain, having built his business not just to accumulate wealth, but to provide jobs for people in our community. When I shipped out for basic training, he was the one who drove me to the airport, telling me stories about his own father's service in World War II. "Service runs in families," he said as we waited for my flight to be called. "Not everyone understands it, but those who do know its value." During my years in the military, I maintained regular contact with both my parents and my grandfather, but the conversations were different. My parents asked surface-level questions about military life, often seeming more interested in when I might transition to civilian work than in the details of what I was actually doing. My grandfather asked specific questions about my training, my responsibilities, the challenges I faced. He remembered details from conversation to conversation and followed up on things I'd mentioned months earlier. The financial assistance continued flowing to my parents throughout this period, though I remained largely unaware of its scope. When they mentioned money problems, I'd offer to send what little I could from my military pay, but they always declined. I assumed this meant they were managing better than they let on, that their financial situation had stabilized as they'd gotten older and more established in their careers. Looking back, I realized my grandfather was probably supporting them more substantially than ever during this period. They were getting older, their earning potential was plateauing, and they'd grown accustomed to a standard of living that required his supplementation. What I didn't know was that some of this support was supposedly designated for me. My grandfather had set aside a significant amount of money, $700,000, specifically to ensure I had proper housing during my military service. He understood that military pay was modest and that basic barracks housing, while adequate, wasn't necessarily comfortable. He wanted to make sure I had options, the ability to rent an apartment off base, to have privacy and space that would make my service more bearable. The money was never supposed to reach me directly. My grandfather had arranged for it to be managed by my parents, who would use it to supplement my housing situation as needed. He trusted them to act in my best interests, to ensure I knew about the resource and could access it when necessary. Instead, they kept the entire arrangement secret from me. They told my grandfather that the money was being used appropriately, that I was comfortable and well-housed. They let me live in cramped barracks conditions while using funds designated for my welfare to improve their own financial situation. The betrayal wasn't just about the money, though $700,000 was certainly significant. It was about the systematic deception, the way they'd allowed me to struggle unnecessarily while benefiting from resources intended to help me. It was about the trust my grandfather had placed in them and the trust I'd placed in them, and how casually they'd violated both. Standing in that room after the ceremony, watching the truth dawn on everyone present, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The family I thought I knew, imperfect but loving, struggling but honest, revealed itself to be something else entirely. The parents who'd raised me, who I'd called every week and visited every holiday, had been living a lie for years. And I'd been completely, utterly blind to it. The silence in the room stretched on until the base commander cleared his throat and suggested people might want to continue their conversations elsewhere. The ceremonial atmosphere had been completely destroyed, replaced by the kind of awkward tension that makes everyone want to escape. My parents approached me as others filed out, their faces wearing expressions I'd never seen before, part shame, part panic, part desperate hope that somehow this could be explained away. "Sweetheart," Mom began, but my grandfather cut her off. "I think you've said enough," he told her, his voice carrying authority that made her step back. Then, to me, "We should talk." The conversation that followed took place in a small conference room down the hall, with my parents sitting on one side of the table and my grandfather and me on the other. The formal setting made everything feel like a legal proceeding, which in many ways it was. My grandfather laid out the facts methodically. 7 years earlier, when I'd first enlisted, he'd established a fund specifically to ensure I had appropriate housing throughout my military career. The money was substantial enough to allow me to rent private apartments near whatever base I was stationed at, eliminating the need for me to live in basic barracks housing. He'd entrusted the management of this fund to my parents, providing them with access to the money and clear instructions about its purpose. They were to help me find suitable housing at each duty station, ensure I knew about the financial resource available, and facilitate payments as needed. "I assumed you knew," he told me, his voice heavy with regret. "When you never mentioned upgrading your living situation, I thought you were choosing to save the money for after your service." My parents had been providing him with regular updates about how the fund was being used. They'd told him I was comfortable, that the money was being used appropriately, that I was grateful for his support but preferred to manage the details privately. Meanwhile, they'd been using the money for their own purposes. The unexplained vacations, the new furniture, the financial flexibility that had puzzled me for years, all of it had been funded by money intended to improve my living conditions during military service. "We were going to tell you," Mom said weakly. We thought you were doing fine without knowing." "Fine?" I stared at her. "I've been sharing a room with strangers for 7 years. Using communal bathrooms, eating at mess halls, having no privacy, no space of my own. You thought I was fine with that when there was money available to change it." We needed help too, Dad said, his voice defensive. Your grandfather helps everyone in the family. This wasn't help for the family, my grandfather said quietly. This was specifically for her. The magnitude of the betrayal was still sinking in. It wasn't just that they'd taken money that wasn't theirs, it was that they'd allowed me to live in substandard conditions while using resources designated to improve those conditions. They'd listened to me describe the challenges of military housing, the lack of privacy, the difficulties of shared living spaces, and they'd never once mentioned that there was an alternative available. Worse, they'd actively maintained the deception. When my grandfather had asked about my housing situation, they'd lied to him. When I'd offered to send them money during their own financial difficulties, they'd declined while secretly using funds intended for me. The conversation lasted 2 hours and resolved nothing. My parents alternated between apologies and justifications, trying to frame their actions as somehow protective of me or beneficial to the family as a whole. My grandfather listened with the patience of someone accustomed to dealing with disappointment, but his expression grew colder as the discussion continued. When we finally left that room, the fundamental relationships in our family had been permanently altered. Trust, once broken on this scale, doesn't simply repair itself through apologies or good intentions. Walking back to my barracks that evening, I tried to process what had happened. Everything I thought I knew about my family's financial situation, about my parents' character, about my grandfather's support, had been revealed as either incomplete or entirely false. The small room I shared with Sergeant Perez suddenly felt different. Not worse, it was exactly the same cramped space it had always been, but now I knew it was a choice I'd been forced to make without complete information. The thin walls, the communal bathrooms, the lack of privacy I'd accepted as part of military life, all of it could have been different if my parents had been honest about the resources available. I sat on my narrow bunk and stared at the certificate from that morning's ceremony, thinking about the irony of being honored for my service on the same day I'd learned my family had been betraying that service for years. The worst part wasn't the money, though $700,000 would have significantly improved my quality of life. The worst part was the systematic deception, the casual way they'd allowed me to struggle while benefiting from my struggle. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Can we talk tomorrow? Before we fly home. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. I don't think so. It was the first boundary I'd ever set with them, but it wouldn't be the last. The week following the ceremony, I didn't answer my phone when my parents called. I let their voicemails pile up, each one more desperate than the last, but I wasn't ready to hear whatever justifications they thought might repair what had been broken. My grandfather, however, I called back immediately when he reached out. I owe you an apology, were his first words. You don't owe me anything, I told him. You tried to help. They're the ones who took advantage. I should have verified that you knew about the fund. I should have checked directly with you instead of trusting their reports. The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had. For the first time, my grandfather shared his perspective on my parents' relationship with money, their history of financial dependency, and his growing concerns over the years about their judgment and honesty. Your grandmother used to worry about them, he said. She thought they took too much for granted, that they never learned to be truly independent. I kept helping because I didn't want you children to suffer for their limitations, but maybe I enabled behavior that should have been corrected long ago. He told me he'd already spoken with his lawyer about the fund. The money my parents had used would need to be repaid, with interest. If they couldn't manage full repayment immediately, arrangements could be made, but the debt would be formalized and legally binding. What about me? I asked. The fund was supposed to be for my housing. It still is, he said. We'll set up a new account, in your name only, with the full amount restored. You can use it for housing now or save it for after your service, whatever makes sense for you. The practical solution was straightforward, but it couldn't address the emotional damage. Learning that my parents had betrayed my trust so completely, and for so long, changed something fundamental about how I saw them and how I saw myself. I'd built my identity partly around being independent, self-sufficient, willing to accept modest conditions in service of a larger purpose. Discovering that I'd been living those modest conditions unnecessarily, while my parents used resources intended to improve them, felt like a theft of more than just money. It was a theft of my agency, my ability to make informed choices about my own life. When I finally listened to their voicemails, the messages followed a predictable pattern. Initial panic and apologies, followed by attempts at justification, then anger at my unwillingness to engage, then more apologies and pleas for understanding. "You're our daughter," Mom said in one message. Family doesn't turn their backs on family over money. But it wasn't about money exactly. It was about honesty and respect and the basic assumption that people who love you want what's best for you rather than what's best for them. I started thinking about all the times over the years when they could have told me the truth. Every phone call where I'd mentioned being tired of Barrick's life, every visit home when I'd seemed stressed about finances, every conversation where they'd listened to me describe military hardships without mentioning that some of those hardships were optional. The deception required ongoing effort. They'd had to coordinate their stories, remember what they'd told my grandfather versus what they'd told me, maintain the fiction that I was comfortable while ensuring he believed his money was being used appropriately. Most painful was realizing that my grandfather's support of our family, which I'd always admired as generous but appropriate, had actually been much more substantial than I'd known. He'd been quietly ensuring all of us had what we needed, but my parents had been taking more than their share and depriving me of mine. 2 weeks after the ceremony, my parents drove to the base without calling ahead. They waited outside the main gate until I finished my duty shift, then approached me as I walked toward the barracks. "We need to talk," Dad said, his voice carrying a desperation I'd never heard before. "No," I replied, not slowing my pace. "We don't." "Please," Mom said, hurrying to keep up. "Just give us a chance to explain." I stopped walking and turned to face them. Standing there in my uniform, looking at these people who'd raised me and betrayed me, I felt a clarity that was both liberating and painful. "What would you like to explain?" I asked. "How you stole $700,000 that was meant to improve my living conditions. How you let me think I had to choose between military service and basic comfort. How you lied to Grandpa for years about how his money was being used." "It wasn't stealing," Mom said quickly. "We're family." You thought what?" "That I didn't deserve to know about resources available to me? That I was better off living in conditions you wouldn't tolerate for yourselves?" They had no answer for that, because there was no good answer. Whatever their motivations, whatever financial pressures they'd been facing, whatever justifications they'd constructed, none of it changed the basic fact that they'd betrayed my trust and my grandfather's trust for their own benefit. "The money will be repaid," Dad said finally. "We're working out the details with your grandfather's lawyer." "Good," I said. "That's between you and him. What about between you and us?" Mom asked, tears in her eyes. I looked at her for a long moment, this woman who'd raised me and taught me right from wrong, who was now asking me to overlook a massive betrayal because we shared DNA. "I don't know yet," I told her honestly. "But I know it won't be what it was before." They left that day without resolution, and I went back to my small room feeling something I'd never experienced before, complete independence from their opinion of my choices. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't care whether they approved of how I was handling the situation. Their approval had lost its value the moment I learned they'd been lying to me for years. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. The next few months brought practical changes that made the betrayal feel even more stark. My grandfather helped me find a small apartment off base, a one-bedroom place with my own kitchen and bathroom and enough space to feel like a real home. The difference was transformative, not just in terms of comfort, but in terms of my sense of self-worth and autonomy. For the first time in my military career, I could invite friends over without coordinating with roommates. I could cook my own meals, keep my own schedule, have phone conversations without worrying about disturbing others. These were basic adult privileges that most people took for granted, but which had been kept from me through my parents' deception. The apartment cost less than half of what my grandfather had been setting aside annually for my housing. My parents had been taking money that would have dramatically improved my quality of life, while I'd been accepting substandard conditions as necessary sacrifices for military service. Living alone also gave me space to process what had happened without the constant low-level stress of communal living. I could think clearly about my relationship with my parents, about what I wanted that relationship to look like going forward, about what boundaries I needed to establish. My grandfather visited once, ostensibly to see the apartment, but really to check on my emotional state. He'd aged noticeably in the months since the ceremony, as if learning about his son and daughter-in-law's betrayal had diminished something fundamental in him. "I keep wondering what else I don't know," he said, sitting in my small living room and looking older than his years. "What other situations I misunderstood because I trusted people who weren't trustworthy." "You couldn't have known," I told him. "They were lying to both of us. But I should have verified. I should have checked with you directly instead of assuming they were acting in your best interests." It struck me that my grandfather was carrying guilt that belonged entirely to my parents. They'd damaged multiple relationships with their deception, not just between them and me, but between him and me, and between him and his own sense of judgment. "They made their choices," I said. "The consequences are theirs to bear." He nodded, but I could tell he was struggling with his own sense of responsibility. This man who'd built a successful business through careful attention to detail, who'd supported our family for decades through thoughtful generosity, had been systematically lied to by people he'd trusted completely. My parents continued reaching out, phone calls, letters, even a card on my birthday, but I wasn't ready to engage. I needed time to understand what I wanted from them, if anything, and what kind of relationship might be possible given what had happened. The hardest part was letting go of who I'd thought they were. The parents in my memory who'd struggled, but tried their best, who'd made sacrifices for their children, who'd taught me values like honesty and integrity, those people turned out to be partly fictional. The real people were more complicated, more selfish, more willing to rationalize betraying their own daughter for financial benefit. Some nights, lying in my own bed in my own apartment, I'd feel angry at how much time and emotional energy I'd spent worrying about them, trying to help them, accepting their limitations as things I needed to work around. Other nights, I'd feel sad about the loss of innocence, the way learning this truth had changed my understanding of everything that had come before. But mostly, I felt clear. Clear about who I was, what I valued, and what I would and wouldn't accept from the people in my life. The betrayal had been painful, but it had also been clarifying in a way that was ultimately valuable. I was learning to trust myself in a way I never had before, without constantly weighing my decisions against what my parents might think or need or want. It was a strange kind of freedom, born from a profound disappointment, but freedom nonetheless. The confrontation came 6 months later at my brother's wedding. I debated whether to attend, knowing my parents would be there and that the family event would create pressure to work things out for the sake of appearance. But my brother wasn't responsible for their actions, and I wasn't going to let their betrayal cost me relationships with other family members. I arrived at the church alone, wearing my dress uniform, and took a seat near the back. My parents were in the front row, looking older and more subdued than I remembered. My grandfather sat separately, on the opposite side of the aisle, acknowledging me with a slight nod when our eyes met. The ceremony was lovely, focused on my brother and his new wife, but I could feel the weight of unresolved tension in the room. Extended family members who knew something had happened but didn't know details cast careful glances in our direction, trying to gauge the family dynamics. At the reception, my parents approached me while I was getting a drink at the bar. The setting was public enough that they couldn't make a scene, but private enough for conversation. "You look good," Mom said carefully. "Military life is treating you well." "It is," I replied, not elaborating on the improvements in my living situation that had made such a difference. "We've been hoping we could talk," Dad said. "Really talk, not just what happened before." I studied their faces, looking for something that might indicate genuine understanding of what they'd done and why it mattered. Instead, I saw the same mixture of shame and defensiveness I'd seen at the base, the same hope that somehow this could be smoothed over through conversation. "What would you like to talk about?" I asked. "About moving forward," Mom said. "About being a family again." "We are a family," I replied. "Just a different kind than we were before." "What does that mean?" I thought about how to explain it, how to articulate what had changed that couldn't be unchanged. "It means I know now that you're capable of lying to me for years about something that significantly affected my life. It means I know you'll prioritize your financial needs over my welfare when it's convenient. It means I can't trust you the way I used to trust you." "People make mistakes," Dad said. "Families forgive. Some mistakes, yes. But this wasn't a mistake, it was a sustained deception that required ongoing choices to maintain. And forgiveness doesn't mean pretending it didn't happen or going back to the way things were. They looked at each other, clearly hoping for something more conciliatory, some indication that time was healing the rift. But time alone doesn't heal betrayal. Trust has to be rebuilt through actions, not just apologies, and I hadn't seen any actions that suggested they understood the magnitude of what they'd done. "We've paid back the money," Mom said. "We're making arrangements to pay your grandfather back, with interest, just like he asked." "That's good," I said. "That's what you should do. So we can move past this?" I shook my head. "Paying back money you stole isn't the same as earning back trust. That's going to take a lot longer, if it happens at all." The conversation was interrupted by the band starting up, people moving toward the dance floor, the normal rhythms of a wedding reception taking over. My parents lingered for a moment, clearly wanting to continue the discussion, but I moved away to congratulate my brother and his new wife. Later that evening, my grandfather found me sitting outside the reception venue, taking a break from the celebration. "How are you holding up?" he asked, settling into the chair beside me. "I'm okay," I said, and meant it. "It's hard, but I'm okay. They want things to go back to normal." "I know. But normal was built on lies. I'm not interested in going back to that." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the parking lot where guests were coming and going. "I've been thinking about what normal looks like now for all of us. Your parents are going to have to live with the consequences of their choices, financially and otherwise. You're going to have to decide what kind of relationship you want with them going forward. And I'm going to have to be more careful about who I trust and how I verify that trust." "Do you regret helping them over the years?" "I regret not being more careful about how I helped. I regret not checking on you directly. But I don't regret wanting to support my family. I just regret being naive about human nature, even among people I should have been able to trust completely." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching people leave the reception, their formal clothes and careful makeup gradually wilting in the evening heat. It struck me that this was what family looked like now, not the easy, uncomplicated relationships I'd imagined as a child, but something more complex and conditional, requiring ongoing negotiation and clear boundaries. "I'm proud of how you've handled this," my grandfather said eventually. "It would have been easy to lash out or make demands or try to hurt them the way they hurt you. Instead, you've been dignified and clear about your boundaries. That takes character." "I learned it from you," I said, which was true. His response to the betrayal had been measured, focused on practical solutions rather than emotional revenge. He'd insisted on repayment not out of vindictiveness, but out of basic justice and the need to establish consequences. "What happens next?" he asked. "I don't know yet. But I know it won't be what it was before. And that's okay." It was the first time I'd said that out loud, that it was okay for things to be different, that I didn't need to fix or restore what had been broken. Sometimes relationships change permanently, and accepting that change is healthier than fighting to resurrect something that was built on unstable ground. The wedding ended with me driving back to my apartment alone, but not lonely. I had clarity about who I was and what I valued, even if that clarity had come at the cost of illusions I'd held about the people closest to me. 2 years later, I received my next promotion, and the ceremony was held at the Pentagon, a much larger, more formal affair than the small base gathering where everything had unraveled. The achievement represented years of hard work and leadership, recognition that my service was making a meaningful difference. My grandfather attended, flying across the country despite his advancing age and increasing frailty. He wore the same dark suit, though it hung more loosely on his diminished frame. When they called my name and I walked across the stage to receive my new rank insignia, I could see him in the audience, sitting straighter despite his arthritis, his face reflecting genuine pride. My parents had not been invited. The decision wasn't made in anger. Anger had faded into something more like indifference over the months. They simply were no longer people I wanted to share important moments with, and I'd stopped pretending otherwise for the sake of maintaining appearances. After the ceremony, my grandfather and I went to dinner at a quiet restaurant near his hotel. The conversation was easy, focused on my new responsibilities and his thoughts about the work I'd be doing. He asked intelligent questions about military structure and policy, showing the same genuine interest he'd always taken in my career. "Your grandmother would have been so proud today," he said over dessert. "She always knew you had something special." "I wish I'd known her better," I said. "I have so few memories of her." "She would have handled this situation differently than I did," he admitted. "She was better at reading people, better at seeing through the things they presented versus who they actually were. She might have caught on to your parents' deception earlier. Or she might have prevented it entirely by being more direct about expectations and accountability from the beginning." He nodded thoughtfully. "She had clearer boundaries. I sometimes helped people past the point where help was useful, where it became enabling instead of support." The conversation turned to practical matters: my new housing allowance, investment advice for the money I was now able to save, plans for my continued education. But underneath the practical discussion was something deeper: the recognition that we'd both learned difficult lessons about trust and family and the complexity of human relationships. "I've rewritten my will," he said quietly, near the end of the meal. "I want to make sure that when I'm gone, there are clearer structures in place. Less room for the kind of misunderstanding that happened before." I understood what he wasn't saying directly, that my parents' betrayal had damaged his trust in ways that extended beyond our specific situation. He was putting legal protections in place to prevent similar situations from arising with other family members or charitable giving. "I'm sorry it came to that," I said. "Don't be. It's a necessary precaution, and frankly one I should have taken years ago. Your grandmother always said I was too trusting for my own good." We parted that evening with a hug that felt different from the ones in my childhood, deeper, more mutual, between adults who'd weathered something difficult together. The relationship had been strengthened by crisis in a way that surprised both of us. Driving back to my apartment that night, I thought about how much had changed since that March morning when my world had been upended by a single question. I lived in a different place, had a clearer sense of my own worth, understood my family relationships in more realistic terms. The changes had been painful but ultimately valuable. My phone had several missed calls from my parents. They'd seen news of my promotion online and wanted to congratulate me. I deleted the voicemails without listening to them, not out of cruelty, but out of a simple lack of interest in maintaining even superficial contact. Some relationships are worth fighting to preserve despite serious damage. Others reveal themselves to be fundamentally incompatible with who you're becoming and what you value. Learning to tell the difference and act accordingly was perhaps the most valuable lesson to emerge from the entire experience. My apartment felt peaceful that night in a way the old barracks never had. Not just because of the privacy and comfort, but because it was a space I'd chosen and could afford based on complete information about my circumstances. It represented autonomy in a way I'd never experienced before the betrayal forced me to claim it. I kept my promotion certificate on the kitchen counter for several days, not because I needed the validation, but because it reminded me of how much I'd accomplished despite the obstacles that had been artificially maintained in my path. The recognition felt earned in a way that went beyond the specific achievements being honored. Eventually, I put the certificate away with the others, filed alphabetically in a folder that represented years of service and growth. But the sense of accomplishment, of having built something meaningful despite being betrayed by people who should have supported me, that stayed with me as I moved forward into whatever came next. The final confrontation happened 3 years later, entirely by accident. I was home on leave, shopping at the grocery store near my grandfather's house, when I ran into my parents in the produce section. The encounter was unavoidable. We saw each other simultaneously across a display of apples, and there was no graceful way to pretend otherwise. They looked older, more worn than I remembered. Dad's hair had gone completely gray, and Mom had developed lines around her eyes that spoke of stress rather than laughter. They were dressed carefully but inexpensively, in clothes that suggested their financial situation had not fully recovered from the consequences of their choices. "Hello," I said simply, not moving closer but not fleeing either. "Hi, sweetheart," Mom said, her voice carrying a desperate hope that made me uncomfortable. "You look wonderful. How are you?" "I'm well. And you?" The small talk felt forced and artificial, a performance of normalcy over a foundation that no longer existed. They asked about my work, my living situation, my plans, questions that felt intrusive coming from people who'd forfeited the right to casual updates about my life. "We think about you all the time," Dad said finally, abandoning the pretense of casual conversation. "We miss you." I believed they missed something, perhaps the version of me who'd accepted their treatment without question, who'd worried about their welfare and offered to help during difficult times. But I wasn't sure they missed the actual person I'd become, the one who required honesty and reciprocity in relationships. "How is your grandfather?" Mom asked. "We heard he hasn't been well." The question revealed their continued disconnection from family reality. My grandfather's health had declined significantly over the past year, information that would have been available to them if they'd maintained relationships with other family members instead of burning bridges through their behavior. "He's managing," I said, not inclined to provide details they could have obtained through appropriate channels. "We'd like to see him," Dad said. "To apologize properly, to make sure he knows how sorry we are about everything." I almost laughed at the transparent attempt to use me as an intermediary. After years of refusing direct accountability, they wanted me to facilitate reconciliation with the person they'd wronged most significantly. "That's between you and him," I said. "I'm not involved in your relationship with Grandpa." The conversation stalled there, with them clearly hoping I'd offer to mediate or provide information they could use to approach him more effectively. When it became clear I wouldn't play that role, the interaction grew more awkward. "We love you," Mom said finally, as if love alone could bridge the gap created by betrayal and maintained by their continued failure to take full responsibility. "I know you believe that," I replied, which was as close to kindness as I could manage. "What would it take?" Dad asked. "For you to give us another chance?" The question was fair, and I'd thought about it many times over the years. What would it take for me to trust them again? What actions or changes would need to occur for a genuine relationship to be possible? "Full accountability," I said after a moment. "Not just for taking the money, but for the years of deception, for letting me live in conditions you knew could be improved, for lying to Grandpa about how his support was being used." And not just admission that these things happened, but genuine understanding of why they were wrong and how they affected everyone involved. They nodded eagerly, as if this was a reasonable requirement they could meet. And then a long period of rebuilt trust through consistent actions. Proving that you've actually changed, not just that you're sorry about consequences. The nodding became less certain. And respect for my boundaries during that process, without pressure or guilt or attempts to force reconciliation before I'm ready. By now they were looking uncomfortable, as if they'd hoped for a simpler answer, a specific gesture or apology that could quickly restore what had been lost. "That could take years," Mom said. Yes, I agreed. It could. And it might not work even then. They exchanged glances, clearly hoping I'd offer more encouragement, more indication that their efforts would be rewarded with the relationship they wanted. "Some things can't be undone," I said gently. "Sometimes the best you can do is accept responsibility and try to be better in the future, without expecting forgiveness or restored relationships as a reward." We stood there for another awkward moment before I excused myself, leaving them beside the Apple display looking smaller and older than when I'd first spotted them. Driving back to my grandfather's house, I felt neither satisfied nor upset by the encounter. It had been necessary, a final clarification of where things stood and what would be required for change. Whether they would or could meet those requirements wasn't my responsibility to determine. My grandfather was sitting on his back porch when I returned, reading a book in the afternoon sun. His movements were slower than they'd once been, but his mind remained sharp and his presence still commanded respect. "How was your errands?" he asked as I joined him on the porch. "I ran into Mom and Dad at the store." He looked up from his book, studying my expression. "How did that go?" "About as well as could be expected. They asked about you, wanted me to facilitate some kind of reconciliation." "And you told them?" "That it was between you and them. Not my business to mediate." He nodded approvingly. "Good boundaries." "It took me too long to learn that lesson, but you seem to have figured it out earlier." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching birds in the garden his late wife had planted decades earlier. The space had been maintained carefully over the years, a living monument to someone who'd understood the value of nurturing things that would outlast her. "Do you think they'll change?" I asked eventually. I think they'll try for a while. Whether they'll sustain the effort long enough for it to matter is a different question. And if they do, then you'll decide what kind of relationship you want with the people they become. But you're not obligated to give them credit for people they used to be or might become someday. It was a wise distinction, one that relieved me of the burden of constantly evaluating their potential rather than their actual behavior. I could respond to who they were now, what they'd actually done, how they actually treated me, without having to factor in optimistic projections about their future development. As the sun began to set, my grandfather closed his book and looked at me with the expression of someone preparing to say something important. I want you to know that watching you handle this situation, the betrayal, the aftermath, the way you've set boundaries and maintained your dignity throughout, has been one of the proudest experiences of my life. The words carried weight because they came from someone whose opinion I valued, but also because I could tell they were earned rather than given out of familial obligation. You raised me to have standards, I said. This is what that looks like in practice. Your grandmother would have said the same thing. She believed that how people handle betrayal reveals more about their character than how they handle success. I thought about that as we went inside for dinner, as we spent the evening talking about books and current events and anything except family drama. There was something peaceful about being with someone who understood that relationships required mutual respect and honesty, who didn't pressure me to accept less than I deserved for the sake of keeping peace. When I left the next day to return to my duty station, I carried with me a sense of completion that had been missing for years. Not because the situation with my parents had been resolved, it hadn't been, and might never be, but because I'd finally accepted that some situations don't require resolution, only clear boundaries and the wisdom to maintain them. The story could have ended with dramatic reconciliation or total estrangement, but real life usually settles into something more nuanced. My parents remained part of my extended family, people I might encounter at weddings or funerals, but they were no longer central figures in my emotional landscape. My grandfather's health continued to decline, but our relationship deepened in ways that might not have happened without the crisis that had forced us both to examine what we valued in family connections. We talked more honestly, spent time together without the complications of managing other people's expectations, built something that was entirely our own. The money, the original $700,000 that had started everything, became a tool for independence rather than dependence. I used it to buy a house near my final duty station, to pursue advanced education, to build a foundation for whatever came after military service. But more importantly, it represented agency, the ability to make choices based on complete information rather than artificial limitations imposed by other people's deceptions. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if my grandfather had never asked that question at the ceremony, if the deception had continued indefinitely. Would I have served my entire military career in substandard housing, never knowing that better options were available? Would my parents have continued taking advantage of his generosity while maintaining the fiction that they were managing independently? But those questions were academic now. The truth had emerged, consequences had been faced, and everyone involved had learned something about the limits of trust and the importance of verification. Years later, when I was finally ready to leave military service and begin a civilian career, I hosted my own ceremony, a small gathering to mark the transition, attended by people who'd supported my journey honestly and consistently. My grandfather was there, friendlier than ever, but still present for important moments. Several military friends attended, along with a few family members who'd maintained appropriate relationships throughout the years of drama. My parents were not invited, not out of ongoing anger, but out of simple recognition that they weren't people I chose to celebrate with. Some relationships end not with dramatic confrontation, but with quiet acknowledgement that they no longer serve anyone's best interests. At that ceremony, my grandfather presented me with a small gift, a framed photo of his wife, my grandmother, that he'd kept on his desk for decades. She would have wanted you to have this, he said. She believed in honoring the people who show you who they really are and responding accordingly. The photo sits on my desk now, in the home I was able to buy with money that was always meant to be mine, surrounded by evidence of choices I was able to make with complete information about my circumstances. It reminds me daily that integrity isn't just about avoiding obvious wrongs, but about maintaining honesty in small, ongoing ways that build trust over time. The betrayal that had seemed so devastating at the time had ultimately taught me the most valuable lesson of my adult life, that my worth didn't depend on other people's validation, that I could set boundaries without guilt, and that some relationships are worth preserving while others are worth releasing. I built a life based on those principles, surrounded by people who'd earned their place through consistent honesty and mutual respect. It wasn't the family structure I'd imagined as a child, but it was better, more authentic, more sustainable, more aligned with my actual values than the fiction I'd been maintaining. The money had been recovered, the practical problems had been solved, and the relationships had sorted themselves into appropriate categories. But the real resolution was internal, the recognition that I deserved to be treated with honesty and respect, and that I had both the right and the responsibility to insist on that standard. Some stories end with forgiveness and restored relationships. This one ended with clarity and appropriate boundaries, which turned out to be more valuable than reconciliation built on an inadequate foundation. Sometimes the best outcome isn't fixing what's broken, but learning to build something better from the pieces that remain trustworthy. The lesson wasn't about money, ultimately, though $700,000 had certainly mattered. The lesson was about character, both recognizing it in others and maintaining it in yourself, regardless of what other people choose to do with theirs. Some people rise to meet high standards, others reveal that they're not capable of meeting them. Both outcomes provide valuable information for making decisions about who deserves your trust and how much of it they've earned. I learned to be grateful for that information, even when it came at the cost of illusions I'd preferred to maintain. The truth, however painful, had set me free to build relationships and a life based on reality rather than wishful thinking. That freedom was worth more than any amount of money, though I was grateful to have both. 10 years after that ceremony, I received word that my grandfather had passed away peacefully in his sleep. The funeral was well attended. Business associates, community members, extended family, and longtime friends who remembered him as a man of integrity and quiet generosity. I delivered the eulogy, speaking about his character and the values he'd demonstrated throughout his life. My parents attended the service, sitting toward the back, looking appropriately somber. We exchanged polite nods across the room but didn't speak directly. The years had created a kind of neutral ground between us, no active hostility, but no meaningful connection either. They'd become distant relatives in the truest sense, people I recognized but didn't really know anymore. The reading of his will contained no surprises for me, though it clearly surprised others. My grandfather had been methodical in his final planning, establishing trusts and foundations that would continue his charitable work while protecting assets from potential misuse. My parents received a modest inheritance, enough to ensure their basic security, but structured in ways that prevented large withdrawals or poor investment decisions. The bulk of his estate went toward scholarships for military families and a foundation supporting veterans' housing initiatives. His lawyer explained that these decisions had been made years earlier, part of the careful restructuring that had followed the revelation of my parents' betrayal. He wanted to ensure his resources would have lasting positive impact, the lawyer told me afterward. He believed that how money is managed reveals character, and he wanted his legacy to reflect his values. I inherited the house where he'd spent his final years, along with personal items that carried more sentimental than monetary value. But the most meaningful bequest was a letter he'd written shortly before his death, sealed and marked for me to read privately. In careful handwriting that showed the effects of age but remained perfectly legible, he'd written about watching me navigate the crisis with my parents and how that experience had reinforced his faith in the values he'd tried to instill. "You learned the hardest lesson of adult life," the letter said. That love without respect and honesty isn't really love at all, and that sometimes protecting yourself requires disappointing people who want something different from you. Your grandmother would have been proud of the woman you became, especially during the difficult years when it would have been easier to accept less than you deserved. The letter went on to explain some of his own regrets, times when he'd enabled poor behavior by making things too easy, when he'd prioritized keeping peace over maintaining accountability. He learned, he wrote, that genuine help sometimes looks like allowing people to face consequences rather than rescuing them from their own choices. Reading his words in the quiet house that was now mine, surrounded by furniture and books and photographs that told the story of a life well lived. I felt the completion of something that had begun that March day when a simple question had shattered my understanding of my family. The house became my permanent residence when I finally left military service. I kept some rooms exactly as he'd left them, honoring his memory, while gradually making others my own. The study where he'd worked became my office. The garden my grandmother had planted became my responsibility and pleasure. Sometimes, walking through rooms that held decades of family history, I thought about alternative versions of this story. What if my parents had been honest from the beginning? What if they'd managed the fund appropriately, ensured I knew about the resources available, treated my grandfather's generosity with the respect it deserved? But those hypothetical scenarios felt less real than the actual outcome. The crisis had revealed essential truths about character and relationships that might have remained hidden under more comfortable circumstances. My parents had shown me who they were when they thought no one was watching. My grandfather had shown me how to respond with dignity when trust was broken. I'd learned how to value myself enough to demand honesty from the people in my life. The foundation my grandfather established in memory of my grandmother has helped hundreds of military families access better housing over the years since his death. Every quarterly report I receive shows families moving from inadequate conditions to homes where they can live with dignity and privacy. It's a legacy that transforms his betrayal by my parents into something constructive, ensuring that other service members don't have to choose between duty and basic comfort. I serve on the Foundation's board now, reviewing applications and visiting families who've benefited from the programs. The work connects me to my grandfather's values while allowing me to use my own military experience to guide decisions about how resources are allocated. Sometimes I wonder if my parents understand the full scope of what their choices cost them, not just the money they had to repay, but the relationships they damaged, the trust they forfeited, the respect they lost. But those questions belong to them now. I've built a life that doesn't depend on their understanding or approval. The story that began with betrayal became a story about integrity, boundaries, and the freedom that comes from refusing to accept less than you deserve. It wasn't the family story I'd expected to live, but it was the one that taught me the most about who I wanted to be and what I valued in the people around me. That knowledge, hard-won and carefully maintained, became the foundation for everything that followed. Some lessons can only be learned through experience, and some experiences, however painful at the time, turn out to be exactly what you needed to become who you were meant to be. And that's how one simple question at my ceremony exposed years of lies. I had to set boundaries I never thought I'd need with my own parents. What about you? Have you ever uncovered a secret that completely changed how you saw your family? Would you have cut ties or tried to rebuild trust? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true stories about family, betrayal, and reclaiming your worth.